There we go. Is that better? All right. All right. Wow, that's loud. All right. So on two different occasions, Abraham is going to tell a lie. But it's not really a lie. But he's going to say that Sarah is his sister as opposed to his wife, in many ways for kind of self-preservation. All right? And if you look over to Genesis chapter 20, we actually have an account of the second of these situations. The first one was in Genesis chapter 12. And in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham journeys to this new territory, and he's going to encounter this king called Abimelech. And Abimelech is going to try to take Sarah because she's beautiful. And Abraham says, she is my sister. He says that in verse 5. God tells Abimelech what's going on here in a dream. So Abimelech's like, whoa, what's going on? I didn't sign up for this. And then in verse 12, Abimelech's going to be talking to Abraham, and he says in verse 10, what did you see that you did this thing? And Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So Sarah is actually going to be a half-sister of Abram. And as we kind of work through this family tree, what we find out is there's a lot of intermarriage between all the individuals on this picture. So I taught a very similar class to this to the high schoolers in the last quarter, and I told them this is going to be a lot like Caroline Kaiser going over and marrying Jackson Kaiser. They're cousins. And of course, they got very grossed out by the whole idea of Caroline and Jackson marrying each other. But that's basically what's going to be happening with all these intermarriages, all right? Many of the people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their spouses, they were all interrelated through this one family tree right here. But there's a reason for that. And the reason is Abraham and his son Isaac and then his son Jacob are going to be living over here in the land of Canaan, surrounded by all these Canaanites. And they did not want their sons to marry into all these Canaanite people that were ungodly. They wanted their sons to marry godly wives. And so on a couple different occasions, they're going to travel all the way back to where they came from, up in Haran, to find a spouse within their family. All right, and so if you look up here, Isaac is going to end up marrying Rebekah, who was a cousin of his. And then Jacob as well is going to end up marrying Leah and Rachel, who also were actually his first cousins. That's the Caroline and the Jackson marrying each other. All right, and we'll kind of look through these if we have time as we kind of work through this. Now, a couple of things I just want to mention. Abraham, as we remember, had his son of promise Isaac through Sarah, but he also had another son, Ishmael, through Sarah's handmaiden Hagar. And Ishmael would give rise to the Ishmaelites. Now, if you look over there on the far left, Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, is going to have two daughters that would give rise to two important nations we see several times in the Old Testament, the Moabites and the Ammonites. Now, there's going to be a tie-in in a couple of weeks to that Moabite nation. And that Moabite nation, a descendant of Lot, is also going to be found in the lineage of Jesus. Anybody recall who that is? Exactly, Ruth. So one of the few women who are described by name in the bloodline of Jesus actually come through the lineage there of Lot through one of his daughters in the Moabite nation. So again, another tie-in to somewhat of the intermarriage relationships between these different individuals. All right, so let's kind of go through and hit a few highlights here of God's plan for Abraham, and then we'll do the same thing for God's plans for Isaac and Jacob. So turn over to Genesis chapter 12, and we will kind of do a quick survey through a portion of these verses here. So Abraham is currently in Haran. So his family's traveled halfway to the land of Canaan. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, God's going to come to Abraham and say, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. He was 75 years old when he departed from Haran to head down to Canaan. Let's see, and then down in verse 7, "And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him." So Abraham has traveled half the way from Ur of Chaldees with his father, and then some time has passed, and now God's going to call Abraham to continue that journey and ultimately end up in the land of Canaan. And then in this verse, God gives Abraham several important promises. He promises Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation." That would be the Hebrew people. "I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you." And he says, "I will give you all the land that you see to your offspring." But the important promise that I want to really look at is the one seen there in verse 3, the latter part of verse 3. "In you all families of the earth shall be blessed." This is the promise that's going to be fulfilled with Christ. Abraham's seed, this lineage that will lead over many generations eventually to Christ, is going to lead to the fulfillment of this promise that God makes to Abraham. How was it that Abraham's seed is going to lead to a blessing to all families of the earth? All right, the sacrifice of Christ. Christ coming to earth, Christ sacrificed on the cross. Through that, we have redemption from our sins. That is the fulfillment of this promise right here. There was a prophecy made all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve had sinned, and God said to the serpent, "You will bruise his heel, but he will bruise your head." This is another similar prophecy looking far down the line at Christ and how this seed that's being passed from generation to generation over many, many years is going to be fulfilled with Jesus himself. All right, so then there are more promises made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. God's going to reiterate some of these promises to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. And then one of those promises is that you're going to have a great nation. But at this point in time, Abraham and Sarah, they're barren. They have no kids. And so Sarah's going to get impatient. Now, she's old at this point in time. And she's given up on God. So she takes her handmaiden, Hagar, and gives her to Abraham, and they have a child together, Ishmael. But was that God's plan? No. They tried to help it along, but that was not God's plan. God's plan is for Isaac. Through Sarah, God intends for Christ to come about. And so Ishmael was not going to be carrying the seed of Christ, it would be Isaac. So in Genesis chapter 21, after more time has passed, verse 1, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham would call his name Isaac. So eventually, after many, many years and many promises made, God is going to keep that promise. And it's not over yet. Abraham is going to have to sacrifice his one and only son that God promised. In Genesis 22, we won't look at that, but you know the story. God calls Abraham and says, take Isaac, your only son, your promised son, the son that's going to give you this great nation I promised you, and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice on the altar. And Abraham has faith. He does it. Now, God stays his hand for the last moment before he actually kills Isaac, and it was all really just a test of Abraham's faith. Abraham passed the test. He demonstrated that faith in God. God keeps his promises, but not always in our timeline. When we make prayers to God, when we ask for God to intervene on our behalf, it's very easy to think about things in our earthly timeline, right? I need this to happen tomorrow. I need this to happen by next week at the latest, God, right? How many years did Abraham wait before he had his promised son Isaac? 100 years. He was 100 years old. That's how long Abraham had to wait. God kept his promise. God kept all these promises that he made to Abraham. The blessing, the son, the great nation, the land. But he also kept that promise about through you all families of the earth will be blessed. But that promise took years and years to come to fruition in Christ. God always keeps his promises. We can rely upon God to intervene on our behalf, but we cannot expect it to be on the timeline that we have in mind. Because God, he does things in his own time. Really, to God, time is meaningless. So that makes it complicated in our minds, because in our minds, time is definitely a factor. But God's going to fulfill that promise with the birth of Isaac, and then Abraham will pass the test when he tries to follow through with offering Isaac as a sacrifice. All right, but then Isaac is a grown man. It's time for him to have a wife. Now, Abraham and Isaac are living in the land of Canaan, and they're surrounded by all these ungodly Canaanites. They're right there close to Sodom and Gomorrah that God's already destroyed for being so awful. Abraham wants Isaac to have a godly wife. So Abraham is going to look over in Genesis 24, take his trusted servant. In chapter 24, verse 1, Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of the heavens and the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites where we dwell, but go to my country, to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. So Abraham's going to take his trusted servant and send him all the way back to Haran, that stopping point on the route to Canaan, at the top of the Fertile Crescent. Go back there to my kindred, find a wife for my son Isaac. And he does that. In verse 15, he makes it there. There's a whole story we won't go through here. But before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. In verse 29, Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. So if we go back to our family tree right here, Abraham has sent his servant back to Haran, and they have found Rebekah. the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Nahor. So this is going to be the granddaughter of Nahor, the great-granddaughter of Terah. And she is going to travel with the servant all the way back to Canaan to meet and to marry Isaac. And they make a family together. In chapter 25, Isaac and Rebekah are going to have twin boys. Verse 19, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? And then she's going to give birth to Jacob and Esau, the twins. And then we, of course, know their story. Jacob's going to be the younger of the two by just a short span of time, but he's going to be the deceiver. Esau was the firstborn, and Esau inherited all the blessings, all the birthright. But Jacob's going to deceive Esau and basically con him out of those promises so that he would receive them himself. In the process, he has to flee because Esau is not happy. So where does Rebekah, his mother, send Jacob away to find safety from the angry brother, but also to find a wife? Right back to Haran. Go to my brother Laban, your uncle, back in that same place where I came from, Haran. Go back there. That's where you'll be safe. And so Jacob's going to travel right back to that same city, that same area, and he's going to find Laban, Rebekah's brother. And then he's going to meet and fall in love with Rachel and eventually marry both Rachel and Leah. And they're going to have a large family, which we can see here. Jacob has two wives now, Leah and Rachel, who are sisters. And then he also has their handmaids, Zilpah and Bilhah. And together, through the four women, he's going to have 12 sons. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, all of those. And which sons are going to be his favorite? The sons of Rachel, right? Joseph and Benjamin are going to be his favorites. But it's really interesting to me that those were the favorites. Those were Jacob's preferred sons. But neither one is going to be who God chooses to carry this seed of Christ. Which of the sons of Jacob are going to carry the seed of Christ? Judah. Not the oldest, not one of the favorites. Judah. He is the fourth son of Leah. But through Judah, many years later, King David is going to come. And that is the pathway God elected, God chose to carry this promise, to carry this seed all the way down eventually to Christ. All right, and then as we kind of wrap up right here, we're going to look at the very beginning of Exodus. So turn to Exodus chapter 1. We're skipping a lot of history. We're skipping a lot of really interesting events with Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. And then there's the whole famine, and the brothers travel to Egypt to get food, and you have the whole dynamic with Joseph and his brothers. But eventually, after all that takes place, Jacob is going to move his family to Egypt. Exodus chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and they're all listed out for us. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all the generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Joseph brings his father Jacob, all of his family, 70 people at this point in time, and brings them all to Egypt to wait out the famine, to survive amidst this famine. They're going to stay there for 400 years. Jacob's family, his descendants, start as 70 men and women, and then 400 years later, they're going to be slaves in Egypt, but there's going to be a whole lot of them. And God's going to raise up Moses and Aaron to lead these people out of Egypt and return back to the promised land. And we will try to pick up there next week. Any comments? I've talked a lot. Any comments or questions?
When you said that that Abraham wanted godly people, is that what he was after, or was it strictly the bloodline? It was that at that point in time there wasn't a commandment or anything. It was more about the bloodline. If you want to say it, he was racist in that fact. I mean, he wanted his people to be pure blood.
Yeah, I mean, so James asked a question about, why did they travel back to Haran to find spouses for Isaac and for Jacob? Was it because they were looking for godly spouses, or was it because they wanted to keep their bloodline intact as opposed to spreading out amongst the Canaanites? I mean, I can see both as being rational explanations. We know that Esau married the Canaanite women really just to spite his father. He saw that it pleased Isaac that Jacob married a family member, and because he was bitter, he intentionally married Canaanites just to get back at his father. I don't have a true answer for you there. In my mind, I think it's because they did not want the ungodliness as opposed to the blood, but the blood certainly could have been a factor. All right. Thank you for your attention.